The first thing I would say is thank you very much to everyone who has come tonight and everyone who's contributed to research in any way. And in answer to the question, what is the value of research and what is the value of what everyone here has done, I'll give a very simple answer, and it is this. There are different ways to make contributions that are positive to humanity and to the world. One of them is to give money, which many people here have kindly given, and certainly money is a very important contribution to allow us to do research and allow many systems in the world to function and progress. The second thing that people can give of themselves is time. So there are researchers who give of their time to dedicate themselves to uplifting humanity. And the third thing that people can do, if people have neither time nor money to give to a cause, is just to support it with positivity. So even if someone's only contribution is to turn up tonight to support diabetes research, or to support a person who has diabetes, or to support the medical profession in helping people with diabetes, that is an extremely valuable contribution to the human race and worthwhile. In answer to the second question, we are going to be talking in a little bit more detail about where is the cure for diabetes and why haven't we found it yet. But I'd like to talk a little bit about a glass being half full rather than half empty. And if we look at things in a slightly different perspective, I would say this. In the last 100 years, we have progressed in remarkable ways in the management of diabetes. From the discovery of insulin and its first use in the early 1920s, in other words, 100 years ago, if you got type 1 diabetes, you would have died, to the fact that our first-line medication for type 2 diabetes, metformin, was actually only used in medicine for the first time in 1957, and quite remarkably, only introduced in the United States in the 1990s. And when we come to understand how far we've come with insulin pumps and continuous glucose monitoring and numerous medications for type 2 diabetes, this has had a remarkable impact on the health and well-being and quality of life of individuals. So the strides that have been made in research have had a real positive outcome on people's lives. Now, framing things slightly differently, medicine has had great difficulty in all autoimmune diseases in finding cures. And whilst those cures may come, it is important to understand the enormous effect and impact that can be had on quality of life and longevity from research findings, despite not finding a cure. So we find, for example, that young patients with type 1 diabetes, previously who could simply not manage their insulin and checking their blood sugars, are now well managed with insulin pumps and devices that check their blood sugars for them, communicate by Bluetooth and via internet with relatives, and suddenly we have a group of people who would not have survived, who can now survive to be elderly, well people. And so it is inestimable the value of allowing someone who might have died from hypoglycemia at age 15 or died of diabetic ketoacidosis at age 20, who will now survive possibly to their 60s, 70s, and 80s with a good quality of life. And the same has been achieved in many areas of diabetes. So much so that one of the discussions I was at today is how to manage resource better in WA because people are having strokes too old. So diabetics used to have strokes when they were 55 and 65, and now with the advances in medicine, people are now having strokes in their 80s. And the result of that is that medical units can't manage because people stay in hospital for a long time in their 80s and get better very slowly. And stroke units were actually designed to manage people in their 60s, which was how things were when they were at their inception only 20 years ago. So in 20 years, we have now reached a point where people are having strokes 20 years later than they used to. So these are things of inestimable value to diabetics and their families to achieve an extra 20, 30, 40 years of life, to achieve quality of life without severe fear of hypoglycemia. And all of this has been achieved through research and technology. So even if we don't achieve a cure for the next 5, 10, 20 years, we have achieved something magnificent, which is the survival and well-being of millions of people around the world. And with that, I'd like to bring my panel up and introduce them as I ask them questions. So panel, would you like to come up and assume your seats, the hot seats? What I'm going to do is I'm actually going to introduce each panel member as I start asking them questions so that you remember who they are. So Liz Davis, the first person on my left, is the lucky winner of the first set of questions. Liz is a pediatric endocrinologist and researcher and head of the diabetes service at Princess Margaret Hospital. Liz, would you like to say a few words about what you do, and then I'll get into asking you some questions.
Sure, thanks Ricky, and welcome to everybody, and thanks for coming along tonight. Ricky's right, I'm a paediatric endocrinologist, which means I'm a doctor who cares for children, and for the last 25 years my work's focused really in the care of children with both type 1 diabetes and more recently type 2 diabetes. And I suppose the other half of my week is spent wearing the hat of one of the directors of our clinical research centre, which has the mission of improving the lives of kids with diabetes.
Thank you, Liz. I'll go right into your questions. New technologies offer potential solutions to replacing the function of the pancreas, and the so-called artificial pancreas is now available in the United States. What is an artificial pancreas? How does it work? And are they ever likely to be truly autonomous? In other words, work on their own without patients having to operate them?
Okay, so Ricky, you've actually already touched on this topic a little bit in your introduction, which is great. And let's start with the artificial pancreas. It's a term that a number of people with diabetes don't like, actually, because they don't think it truly represents the job that it does. But having said that, it is the term that really sits, and we hear by both lay and scientific groups. The artificial pancreas really, in this day and age, is the word or the term to define the technological developments to date that try and mimic the pancreas in its normal state. So for people with type 1 diabetes, the endocrine function of their pancreas is lost, and this is the ability of the pancreas to make insulin in response to increased glucose levels or the thought of a meal. That's what's lost in type 1 diabetes, which is where these technologies are mainly applicable. And the artificial pancreas as we know it today really comes in 2 or perhaps 3 pieces. A sensor, which again Ricky touched on, and many of you, if you're in the diabetes community, would be aware of continuous glucose sensors because they were funded by the government in April of this year for certain groups of people with diabetes. And the sensor detects what the blood glucose level is doing. So it's designed to, first of all, reduce the burden of finger pricking, which is how people until recently have measured their blood glucose level, and it actually gives you a continuous trace. So for years, when kids come to see us in clinic, it's always, we have a look at their blood glucose levels, and there's always this sort of, not conflict, but it's always, we'd like to see lots of blood sugars as with their parents, and they don't want to do their blood glucose levels. So it's kind of replaced that in a way that the blood glucose levels are available. Whether they want to look at it on, people want to look at it on, it's a second thing. And then that links up to a pump which is designed to deliver insulin in response to those blood glucose levels. And to work, it's got a computer algorithm in there, which is getting better and better with time. And I think that's where, when you talk about the artificial pancreas, each of these elements continues to have incremental improvement thanks to research and development from both clinical researchers and industry who've driven this research enormously as well. You asked me if it's ever going to be autonomous. Do you want me to answer that? Sorry, I forgot that bit. Will it ever be autonomous? Some people would say it's actually autonomous now, and the one that's available in the States, you do need to bolus for meals, but if you don't, you still actually can run with not as good blood glucose levels, but you can actually run with reasonable blood glucose levels. Whether it will be fully autonomous and maintain excellent blood glucose levels, which we know can prevent complications for a long period of time, I believe we will get to that stage. There are some challenges to be, hurdles to be jumped, but I think we will get there one stage, yes.
That's very useful. Thank you, Liz. The second question for you is, what is the current state of closed-loop technologies in Western Australia, and how are we contributing to the research, knowledge, and use of these systems?
Okay, thanks. I think the concept of what we do in WA is something Ricky's touched on already. And in WA, we don't develop these technologies. We don't drive the research that creates the little bits inside, but we do trial them. And I think that's a really, really strong, important message for a number of reasons. From my perspective, our unit's been involved in trialling the new sensors as they've come on the market, the new pumps, and now the closed loop in a number of trials. And the adult centres have also joined us more recently in some closed loop trials. It has huge impact, so patients get exposure to technology that's not yet on the market, which can be, really exciting, and they feel involved and have the opportunity to have access to technology that otherwise they wouldn't. I constantly remind our team and our patients that history tells us that there's about 20 years taken, or it requires 20 years to translate a finding in research into something that directly helps patients in the clinic. And so that's a long time frame, and it's something you need to remember, because we all want to make things happen tomorrow. But all the little improvements add to eventually that translation that will happen down the track. And so by giving patients exposure to these technologies, I think is a great opportunity. From our team's perspective, it's great for the team to understand these new technologies and be able to integrate them into clinical practice. But I actually think another really important perspective of what we do in WA is that we collect data and we have information that allows both the patients and the clinical teams to be advocates with either their local politicians, federal politicians, whoever they can, advocacy to try and drive the pipeline to bring these technologies to Australia as soon as possible, I think are invaluable, and I think that's a major contribution we've been able to make.
Thank you, Liz. That was excellent. What about other novel advanced therapies and technologies such as molecular or smart insulins?
So what Ricky's referring to there is, there's all sorts of streams of research going, around the world addressing type 1 diabetes. Technology is one. Other large groups have taken the approach, if we could alter insulin so we could put it back into the body in some form and it would respond to glucose like the beta cell does, that would be a really exciting way forward to try and improve diabetes care. I personally haven't got any hands-on experience with smart insulin myself, but the principle is different ways of binding insulin and presenting it to the body. So patches, tablets, all sorts of things are being developed and trialled, that when it gets exposed to an increase in blood glucose level, the nature of that packaging would change and release a little bit of insulin, which would then bring the blood glucose down. And so that's really exciting in terms of something that's not attached to the body with technology. On the other side, it does bring challenges. Anyone in the room who knows someone with diabetes knows that trying to avoid hypoglycemia is a big part of diabetes, and so if insulin was released in error, that would be of significant concern, so there are challenges being addressed there. And certainly from my perspective, the paediatric perspective, we expect this insulin will be trialled in adults first, because small doses of insulin in a kid can have a big impact. And so there are lots of challenges to bring that insulin to fruition, but there's some really exciting things happening around the world in different areas to bring that smart insulin to fruition. So I'm sure we'll see some significant changes there in the next few years.
Thank you, Liz. That was excellent. And I think also just to say that having these new technologies for people who put money into diabetes research, for people who put money into diabetes, that having these new technologies has entirely changed the game when it comes to managing pediatric diabetics, because the previous inability of doctors to know much about blood sugars, to get patients to check blood sugars, and to actually have any useful information is only one aspect of management, but also that children and their parents are actually now able to positively engage in managing diabetes, gain momentum, which often knocks on into adulthood and allows people to feel more positive about themselves, have better health, and improve their quality of life. So these are all really significant things that are being done in diabetes research in WA and pediatrics. And thank you, Liz, for all that you do.
Pleasure.
Now I'm going to introduce our second panel member, who is Professor Grant Morahan. He is Director at the Centre for Diabetes Research. Welcome, Grant. Would you like to say a few words about aspects of what you do?
Thank you. Yes, I'm the Professor of Diabetes Research at University of Western Australia, and also the Director of the Centre for Diabetes Research at the Harry Perkins Institute. The Centre for Diabetes Research, of course, was set up by Diabetes Research WA. We do research into many aspects of diabetes, mainly focusing on the genetics of type 1 diabetes, but we also do many other things, including genetics of diabetes complications, looking at using stem cells to recreate insulin-producing cells, and many other aspects of diabetes research.
Thank you, Grant. I'm glad you mentioned stem cells, because I'm going to ask you a few questions about those. So I think many diabetics know that stem cells seem to be the popular, obvious cure for diabetes to replace all the need for insulin pumps and monitoring. And despite lots of media attention and promises over the years, no one seems to have successfully turned stem cells into insulin-producing cells or islets. Are stem cells the most likely source of a true cure? And won't they just fail in the same way the pancreas of people with type 1 diabetes have failed?
Well, there's a lot of subtext to that question. Let me just address the first thing, which is the theme of this meeting tonight, and that is, why don't we have a cure yet? Of course, there are hundreds, or if not thousands, of researchers working towards a cure around the world, and we each use our own special techniques to find it. Let me use an analogy. If you think that a cure is like a building, so of course you know if you want to build a house, you need to have a brick. You need to put one brick on top of another. And that's what we have to do with diabetes research as well. We need to find many different answers to specific questions and build on that, build one after the other until we get to the final destination. But it's not like building a house where there's a ready supply of bricks. We have to actually invent every single one. And by doing that, we then need to show to the world that what we've found with that particular discovery is real and it's reproducible by other people as well. And not only that, but this particular brick that we developed has to then support the big structure that's coming on top of it. So all this work is important. Now, to get back to your question, why is it so difficult trying to make stem cells, guide them into insulin-producing beta cells? There are many answers for that, but it's taken evolution thousands of years to be able to come up with a method with finding the right molecules at the right time to act on the right cell type, to transition it through all the very many stages into the insulin-producing cell. It's only very recently that we've found out how to do this. But of course, there are other problems as well in translating this into a cure. And for type 1 diabetes, it's particularly challenging because of the autoimmune response that led to type 1 diabetes in that person in the first place. So the recipient of a stem cell graft, if it was made, would also have to have some treatment to turn off their autoimmune response. So it's not just a matter of researching stem cells, it's also a matter of researching the immune system and finding out ways to divert that immune response. All these things are very challenging. But as you pointed out earlier, we're making great progress. There's been more progress made in the last 10 years than there has been in the previous 100, but we are getting there, and it's a matter of being patient.
Thank you, Grant. That's an excellent answer. How far advanced are current attempts to generate islets or beta cells from stem cells?
There's some work that we've been doing in the Centre for Diabetes Research, which is very advanced. I think that we've been competing literally against companies in the US that have $100 million budgets, and we have been able to beat them. That is that the researchers working on this project have been able to identify particular compounds that are able to act on progenitor cells and turn them into insulin-producing cells. They've been able to define the nature of those progenitor cells in such a way that they can purify them from various cell sources. They've been able to extend this work from experimental models and mouse models into humans and show that the human cells have the same features as the mouse cells do. And they've been able to guide these cells, as I say, into being able to produce insulin in response to glucose. And when transplanted into mice, have been able to improve diabetes in those mice. So there is very exciting research.
Is Australia, Western Australia, contributing to research in this area?
Well, as I said, this research that we have been doing was a great contribution to this area. Fortunately, we're no longer working on this because we don't have enough money to support the researcher who was doing this work, and so he's now lost to do science. He's had to move into another area where he can get money to support his family. And insofar as Australia is concerned, I think there's probably only one group in Australia now that's working on stem cells, and that's in Sydney with Professor Bernie Tuck.
Thank you. Are there other particularly genetic potential solutions?
All tools in science have a particular purpose. So, the genetics is very useful, and it's what I'm particularly interested in. Genetics is useful for understanding more about the causes of diabetes, and remember that's one of the goals of the Diabetes Research WA, finding out the causes. It makes us understand the disease process better. For example, we've shown that there are 6 different ways that people can have type 1 diabetes, and these ways also differ in other clinical features. So genetics is very useful, and it's particularly useful as well to be able to identify those people who can most usefully have a treatment. So it's likely that those 6 different types of type 1 diabetes may have different cures. So we'd need to tailor the cure to the person. This is called personalised medicine or precision medicine, and an advanced knowledge of genetics is essential to precision medicine.
Thank you, Grant. It's exciting to hear that we are making advances in technology and in stem cells. Thank you very much. I'm going to introduce our next panel member, who is Dr. Gerard Chu. Gerard is a senior lecturer at the University of Western Australia. He's also an endocrinologist at Royal Perth Hospital. Gerard, do you want to say a few words about yourself and your work in diabetes?
Okay, so Gerard Chu's my name. I wear a few hats, as Ricky has said. So I'm one of the consultant endocrinologist at Royal Perth Hospital, which is where I do most of my work with diabetes. I also am head of Department of Internal Medicine at Royal Perth, so that's another part of my clinical work. And some of the, apart from teaching medical students, some of my research interests have been with some of the cardiovascular complications of diabetes, particularly type 2 diabetes, and also some of the foot problems we're having with diabetes. We have a foot unit at Royal Perth Hospital that's started for a few years, and we see a lot of foot problems. My sort of involvement with DRFWA is that for a few years now, Joey's, who's my classmate and colleague, we went through medical school together, has asked me to help oversee some of the grants process about looking at the whole process of awarding grants and assessments and so on. So that's my involvement with DRFWA.
Thank you, Gerard.
And unlike Liz, who deals with kids, I deal with adults, and unlike Grant, who deals with cells, I sort of deal with intact humans in that sense. So that's where I come from.
So Gerard, pancreas and islet cell transplants are options for the treatment of type 1 diabetes. Why and when would someone be considered for a transplant?
So I guess I'll take it to the broader question about the theme of tonight, which is cures, and what is the cure for diabetes? And I guess a cure depends on what you call a cure, in the sense that, for example, if you have something like an infection, or you have something, or a skin cancer, if you get rid of it or treat it, then essentially that's a cure. But in diabetes, it's a little bit different, and in this sense that there's a condition where you don't have something, basically. You have a process that's sort of disabled or destroyed insulin producing cells. So that's the condition. So in order to sort of cure it as opposed to just treat it, there may be different ways of approaching it. There can be a technology-based sort of approach where technology may be good enough to actually do the function of the thing you're missing. So in that sense, it's a cure by fulfilling the function that was there before. Or in the case of a grant, if you can actually teach stem cells and so on to grow again, you can actually replace what was missing. So cure for something that's missing is a little bit different from cure for something you have in that sense. So for example, if you're missing a hand, you could get, if you like, an artificial hand that fulfills the function of a hand. So that might be a cure for not having a hand. Or you can maybe try and grow cells from where the hand was to make a new hand. So a transplant is a bit like, if you think about missing a hand transplant, where you co-opt tissue that is functional from another place, in this case a donor who's been deceased, or in the case of pancreas or islet cells, and you see whether that can work in a patient with diabetes because you're missing the functioning cells or the functioning pancreas. The difficulty with transplantation is because you're using tissue from someone else who's not you, then your body's immune system and defenses will be there to try and protect you from external strangers, if you like. So it'll mount the thing you're trying to sort of get working in you to replace what you're missing, your body's actually fighting it. So there's a, if you like, a need for very strong medications to try and control that response so that the transplant can work without it failing. And in that sense, the transplant isn't for everyone because there are lots of risks attached to the medications you need to make the transplant work. Apart from the fact also that the transplants are fairly uncommon in terms of availability and so on. You've seen all these campaigns to look at, organ donation because there's probably much less sort of available for transplants than there are people who might need them, for example. So at the moment, in terms of who's eligible, you have to balance the potential risks of transplantation as well as the availability of the rather scarce resource and find certain niches of people who might be best suitable for transplantation. So, for example, a pancreas transplant is actually, and also the likelihood of whether they'll succeed and so on. At the moment, most people who have pancreas transplants in Australia usually do it together with a kidney transplant. Because, as you well know, sometimes in badly controlled diabetes, as it progresses, kidney failure may be a complication of that. And you're probably familiar with kidney transplantation as a treatment for kidney failure. And diabetes is a major cause of kidney failure. And in doing a kidney transplant when someone is already failing and doesn't want to continue on dialysis so it can't happen, then the kidney transplant gives them a solution for the renal failure. But if you're going to give someone strong medications to maintain the kidney transplant, exposing that risk, then the pancreas transplant may be not a lot more risk if you do it as a combined sort of procedure. And this will happen in someone, for example, who has pretty advanced or end-stage kidney failure, who also would benefit from transplant in the sense that their diabetes is not going to be easily or well controlled and it's giving a lot of problems that we can't manage with technology and insulins and so on. For example, someone who's getting a lot of severe erratic hypoglycemia, lots of unawareness, who, despite the advances we have with technology, we can't really manage that terribly well. And if they also have, if you like, bad kidney failure, then a combined procedure of a simultaneous kidney and pancreas transplant would be able to fix that and not expose people to more risk. And essentially, people need to be fit enough to deal with the complications of immunosuppression, as well as fit enough to actually benefit from the benefits of the transplant itself. So you need to be fairly young. So I think the cut-off age is around 50 at the moment because older patients do less well with the transplant, their outcome and the loss of the transplant, the function overall, and also the, I guess, competitive sort of illnesses from cardiovascular disease and so on would make the transplant less successful, and we have to kind of ration it out that way. So someone who's fairly fit, not a lot of heart disease, who's young enough is generally for that scarce resource.
Thanks, Gerard. Where are these transplants performed? Are they available to people in the state, and what's involved?
There's a transplant program nationally, and most of these transplants are actually done by the Westmead Group in Sydney. There's actually there's some transplants now being done in the Monash Group in Melbourne because I think it was a spillover of the transplants that could be done. I think Westmead do around about 30 odd a year, and most of them are simultaneous pancreas and kidney transplants. And Melbourne does about, I think, 10 or 15 or thereabouts. And also, you asked about islet transplantation. So islets aren't taking the whole pancreas, but it's actually taking some of the islet cells, which are the insulin-making cells in the pancreas, from a donor and actually giving it to a recipient, someone with diabetes, and it's usually sort of lodged in the, introduced to the liver, where hopefully they will take and then basically function as insulin-producing islet cells, not in the patient's pancreas, but in somewhere else. And the difficulty with that is that they're fairly fragile and vulnerable cells, which means a lot of times these islet cells might not take, might not survive in this graft failure. There may not be enough islet cells to actually make a patient free of diabetes, but it may help with some of the ups and downs. It may reduce their insulin requirement and so on. So some of this islet transplantation work is being pioneered, mostly again at Westmead, which is the main islet pancreas transplant centre in Australia. And anyone who's sort of eligible around Australia, and they've dealt with patients from WA, Tasmania, NT, Queensland and so on, can get referred, and then they'll figure out if they're essentially eligible and fit and meet all the criteria, and then one would get on a waiting list, and then like any other sort of transplant, and then when your number's called up, hopefully with the right matches, etc. and so on, then you get a transplant.
If someone is qualified and jumps through all the hoops and is a candidate for transplantation, how successful are their outcomes generally?
For simultaneous pancreas kidney transplants, the graft survival and patient survival is actually pretty good. I think at 5-year survival is in excess of 90%. I think things are getting better all the time because, for two reasons. I think the immunosuppression and management of that is actually better. But more importantly, I think the transplant groups are really trying to select the right patients who have the best outcomes for this. So like I said, it's not for everyone. It's a scarce resource. You need to be fit enough for it. But by selecting the right sort of people, then you can actually hopefully get reasonably good results.
Thank you very much. That was very useful and very inspiring that we have come such a far way in medicine. It's very easy to take things like transplantation for granted, but organ transplantation is actually something very new, and the distance that we've traveled in a very short time to actually achieve 90% success rates is quite remarkable and something to really feel quite enthusiastic about. I'm going to move on to our next panel member, who is Joey Kay. Joey Kay is head of the diabetes service at Charles Gardner Hospital and an endocrinologist. Joey, do you want to say a few words about yourself?
Thank you, Ricky. So I have two hats. I am, as Peter mentioned, the Deputy Director of DRWA and kind of serve from a medical advisory point of view. And then my other hat is I am an adult endocrinologist based at Charlie's.
Thank you, Joey. Your heading is Prevention May Be Better Than Cure. What prevention strategies are currently being investigated?
So I think, as people have mentioned, or is obvious, cure comes in many different guises, and there are different ways of defining that or dealing with that, one of which is to hopefully come up with a strategy which avoids the disease in the first place. And can we actually stop people getting diabetes? In order to do that, we need to know a few things. We need to be able to identify the person who is at risk of or who is going to get diabetes. We need to know what are the environmental triggers that might set off the supposed immune process that's going to cause the destruction. We need to know the detail of how that immune dysregulation or dysfunction might occur, and then we need to know what are the things that sort of enable or progress that or cause repeated attacks, etc. So in order to be able to block or stop or remove some of those things, we need to have a clear understanding of what all of those things are and how people move through all of those phases of developing diabetes. Diabetes just doesn't happen overnight. It's something that is set up right from birth and will occur in different people at different stages and at different rates. So in terms of prevention, there are lots of strategies that have been tried, each of which has tried to address those particular stages. So if we can identify people who are at risk and remove the triggers that we think might set them up to start with, that might help. And there have been trials, for example, in young children where the theory might be cow's milk allergens or cow's milk proteins or other food things. If you remove the child from that exposure, that may perhaps reduce their risk. If we know eventually when some people start to develop inflammation in their pancreas, can we divert their immune system or make their immune system more tolerant to what's going on? And for example, there are trials giving small doses of insulin to try and divert people's pancreas, their immune system away from attacking their pancreas, and perhaps focus on the insulin that's been given. And then if we understand what the actual immune process is that's causing inflammation and destruction of the beta cell, there are a number of trials of drugs that are anti-inflammatory, block that inflammatory process or block that immune process that might stop things at that point. So lots and lots of potential strategies and lots of things have been trialled. So removing some of those environmental things like foods and adding vitamin D or something like that. Anti-inflammatory agents, some of the immune suppressants that Jared mentions for transplant have been tried. Some of the new fancy immune therapies have all been tried. But for the most part in humans have not been particularly successful. So there have been a few small successes. There have been some trials in a small group of people in some of the studies that have shown some benefit, a little bit of delay in how quickly they might progress along the road to developing their diabetes. But for the most part, at least in type 1 diabetes, we haven't yet found a clearly successful strategy.
Thank you, Jerry. That was very useful. As our next stage of the evening, we're actually going to turn to you, the audience, so that you can ask some questions, and you can feel free to ask questions both about type 1 diabetes and if you prefer on type 2 diabetes as well, because we focus mainly on issues around type 1 tonight. So please feel free to ask our panel any questions you may have.
Oh, got one down the back. That's great.
Thank you. On the subject of organ transplants, is there any research into 3D printing a pancreas from a patient's own cells?
Oh, I don't know too much about 3D printing. My understanding of 3D printing, it's usually with prostheses and so on in the medical sort of sphere, where you can sort of create structural objects out of non-living materials. So I don't know too much about whether you can actually create something as finessed as a cell with 3D printing. So I can't really answer that. Most of the 3D printing I know, I've seen applications in medicine have been to do with making structural sort of prostheses and things like that. But I don't know whether Grant's got a comment about an analogous sort of thing with trying to make stem cells into patients' working cells, perhaps.
I think that you're right. I think that there are some attempts to do 3D printing with cells, but I think the technology is far too immature to apply this to islet cells right now. The big problem is in generating those cells in the first place. That's the main issue. But then once they're generated, they can be transplanted or be encapsulated without the need for a 3D printer. I think that's probably the least difficult part of the whole procedure.
Thank you. We are open to more questions.
This is your opportunity.
I'd just like to thank all you guys for taking the time tonight. I've already learnt so much. I'm what you'd probably call a bad diabetic. I'm trying to be a bit more like my friend Caroline here, so it's been a really good night for me already. My question is for Liz. I'm not sure if I misinterpreted or if this is like a real hard truth night for me, but can you explain the 20-year gap between discovery and actually implementing a cure, say?
Yeah, sure. I suppose I was probably just trying to put in context that when you talk to researchers who work in any aspects of medical research, so one of the big discoveries, say the HPV vaccines. I was at a workshop today and we were talking about vaccinations, which is applicable to diabetes as well, but this was a general vaccination discussion. But from when the first work was done in the lab for the human papillomavirus vaccine, which is what's now changing the impact on cervical cancer around the world, from when that first happened to the lab to when the first vaccines went out was 20 years. And that started a discussion that there's, across all fields of medical research, that is the figure that generally is recognised from when something's first done in the lab. We're showing some signs of success, or, when the first positive things, to when we actually go through all the experiments to trial it and to see whether it's going to have side effects, and it's often done in a mouse first, and then it might be developed for humans, and then it's goes through its various trialling phases to when it actually turns into a treatment that is relevant, that we can apply, offer to our patients. It's a long time, isn't it? 20 years, and so I think it's quite a sobering thought when you're working in this space, but it's also important to not overpromise in what you're going to deliver, but to recognise, as Grant said, I think that each little piece adds to that puzzle, and sometimes it takes one little discovery and you actually go from here to here quite quickly, which is exciting. But the reality is, all those bits add to the picture, but it can take quite a long time for things to happen, and it's the support of research, both the brains and the money and the commitment of the patients and families who take place, that helps speed up that process. Yeah. And I just want to say that I don't think there's any such thing as a bad diabetic. Everybody goes through patches perhaps where they're less focused on their disease or find it harder to manage, but I think all of us would encourage people not to think of themselves as a bad diabetic.
So thank you, Liz. That was very useful. And I think to add to that...
Sorry, could I just add? Maybe I was going to say what you were going to say. One of the reasons why it takes so long is that we have to make sure that any new treatment is going to be safe. And so it has to go through a very strict process of first preclinical trials, making sure it works there, then with phase 1 clinical trials in humans, then if it works there, it goes into phase 2, and then phase 3. So each one of these phases in the clinical trials development pipeline is very highly regulated, and any new treatment has to prove its efficacy and safety at each one of those. And so that's the main reason why it takes so long to translate from the lab to the clinic.
Thank you. And coming back to what I said in my introduction, I think it's very important to celebrate the human spirit in this setting, to say that many researchers work in areas where they know that they will not live, or their careers will not be long enough to necessarily see the outcome of what they do. But each dollar that's donated to research, each person that contributes positively to it, and each researcher who adds to what's been discovered in the past adds an extra step forward for the progress of humanity. And the impact of that in the long term is what allows human beings to get better, to live longer, and to have better lives. So all of these contributions are incredibly valuable and made more altruistic by the fact that many researchers know that they cannot achieve the final step towards what they're actually working on, or the final step what they're working on. So thank you, Liz. We're very happy to take, there's another question in the middle.
Yeah, hi. And hello to the panel. I'm interested in your breakthroughs book on page 17. One of the breakthroughs has been developing MRI brain scans which help predict people with type 2 diabetes getting dementia. And as we know, that's quite often Alzheimer's has now been called type 3 diabetes. I'm just interested in whether one of our panel here is the person that drove that breakthrough, or to whom we would turn to for more information. I've got a particular interest in that.
So that was a study that DRWA funded, was one of the grant projects that we awarded, I think, a couple of years ago, which was looking at a new technique of functional MRI imaging in people with type 2 diabetes and how that might predict or relate to cognitive decline. So I don't know if we've got some detail about who the researcher was. It wasn't anyone on the panel, but it was one of the awardees that we did fund. That project has been going. I don't know whether it's been completed, but we could certainly, I'm sure, get hold of some details about them and about the outcomes of that project.
Do we know who the researcher was, or? At UWA. Okay, thanks.
Dr. Gerard, is there a useful use-by date for pancreases for organ donors?
In the same way that younger recipients do better, they've also found that the age of the donor at the time of the donation of the pancreas does matter. So in general, younger grafts do better in that sense. And obviously grafts from donors who are free of other illnesses and disease as well.
My question is, with the diagnosis of new diabetics, type 1, is there clusters or a prevalence in certain areas of the metropolitan area or Western Australia? And do you find that there are more diagnoses at certain times of the year, like say with winter viruses, and is there a correlation?
Okay, thanks. It's a good question. It sort of sets the scene to what's happening with type 1 diabetes in WA, and I can give you the paediatric perspective. So when we do what we call epidemiology studies, which are the sort of the study of incidence and patterns, most of our data goes up to 18-year-olds, so I can't really put it in context of what happens above that. But what's happening in WA is that type 1 diabetes is going up every year, and if you look at the graph, it sort of goes up at an angle like this of about 2 to 3% per year, which means over 10 years, that's a 20 to 30% increase in type 1 diabetes. And interestingly, exactly what you say, that occurrence of diabetes, although it's going up, is clustered around winter. So if we look at a seasonal pattern, we get more presentations with diabetes in winter. It doesn't mean that people convert to become, well, I suppose it doesn't mean that winter causes it. It may be the stress of some of the viruses or the other environmental agents at the time precipitate someone whose pancreas is getting close to diabetes to getting stressed and tipping over into the diabetic scenario. And what's actually interesting in WA, and is shown to be reproduced other places in the world more recently, is there's a 5-year pattern which we're trying to unpack and understand, that there's a 5-year pattern of peaks and then troughs. So not only is there a seasonal incidence where it goes up over winter, but we're actually finding a sort of 5-year pattern that does this, which is very interesting, and whether that's related to environmental agents, to infectious agents, to the weather, we don't know. But actually on the other side of the world, people have identified a 5-year pattern as well, which makes the things I think that Jerry was touching on before, it's so hard to unpack what those drivers are to causing type 1 diabetes. And I just wanted to put in a plug for a study, if I could, which when Joey was talking I was thinking of, which is not a DRWA funded study, but it's nonetheless an important study that WA is taking place in, called ENDIA around the world, which is actually tracking mothers who are giving birth to high-risk babies. So if there's someone in the family with type 1 diabetes, and following them from the pregnancy period through the delivery of the baby and following the baby over time, collecting all the information that Joey touched on. So information about the environment, information about infections, breastfeeding, food, to try and identify some of those causal pathways. So it is a study WA is participating in, and I think it's close to a lot of people's hearts because it's trying to work out what those environmental agents are that might be triggering diabetes.
There's another question in the middle.
Hi Liz, just coming on from talking about India, I'm aware of a family that recently had a young boy who doesn't have type 1 diabetes, his sister does, who was showing some of the markers, and he was flown to Sydney to be infused with, I think, some of his cord blood. I was really interested to understand what what that research is looking at and how that might be effective, if that's something you're aware of, been involved with?
I am aware of the study. I'm not an investigator on the study. The concept is, and I suppose it's a little bit along the lines of stem cells, and some of the others might be added to it more, that perhaps some of the cells in your cord blood, which is the blood that's taken when a baby's delivered from the cord that goes to the placenta, and it was often discarded, and increasingly these days people are collecting cord blood with the concept that perhaps it could be used later to either generate stem cells or be used with the stem cells on board. And there is a hypothesis that perhaps infusing those cells, which can be stored and can be frozen for a cost over a period of time, I think they freeze them anyway, they keep them in some way in a freezer, in a fridge, and then reinfused into somebody who's been shown to be at risk of diabetes. And so you get shown to be at risk of type 1 diabetes by doing blood tests that show you have antibodies in your blood, which are, I suppose, what we call the prodrome of type 1 diabetes. And there's a whole part of different antibodies, and you can have one, or once you get two, you have a higher risk. And once you have three, your risk of type 1 diabetes is essentially 98 to 100% over the next 10 years. And so this is a study, it's called the CORD study, the CORD study. And it's one of those things, I think, where if you're at the risk of 100% in 10 years or 98% in 10 years, the benefit perhaps outweighs the risk. There isn't very much data internationally about the outcome of infusing cord blood, but it's another one of the sort of trials that's out there along with many that Joey mentioned in terms of trying to either delay or prevent onset of type 1 diabetes.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to call Joey Kay to take my place at the podium to award the research projects. Thank you, Joey.